Allahu Akbar. Praise Allah. The end of the Zionist entity, as they call it, Israel, is at hand. Our previous assumption that we would need decades to bring about their internal collapse and destruction has been overtaken by the events. The Zionists are committing national suicide with just a little help from us. Their 75th anniversary celebrations may be the last. I just quoted from the article, Zionists committing national suicide. It is the article in form of letter from Hossein Salami, commander of Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, to President Raisi, Iranian president. Top secret, for your eyes only, urgent. Now, somehow this message was gotten by our guest, Chuck Freilich, and now we'll talk to him about what it means. The author of this article that I just quoted from, Chuck Freilich, the former deputy of National Security of Israel, is our guest, and we'll ask him some questions about what's going on in Israel, Chuck.
Well, we're in the midst of what is, I believe, the worst, certainly domestic crisis that Israel has faced. And to a certain extent, the country is simply coming apart. The government proposed a series of so-called judicial reforms. Some of us, myself included, believe that this isn't a matter of judicial reform, but a matter of a judicial wrecking ball, in which they are severely, if it goes through, they will be severely undermining not just the independence of Israel's judiciary, but in point of fact, the entire democratic system. It's important to understand that in parliamentary systems such as Israel, you really only have two branches of government to begin with, the executive and the judiciary, because the executive, in effect, controls the Knesset, the parliament. You don't really have the kinds of checks and balances that you have in the American system between the Congress and the presidency. Here, the only check on executive power is the judiciary. And Israel's judiciary, I mean, nothing is perfect in life, but it was always an extraordinarily positively, highly regarded judiciary. Okay, maybe they wanted a couple of changes to be made. That's legitimate. But what they're doing here is putting an end to checks and balances. They're putting an end to judicial oversight. And a lot of people in Israel fear that the result will be that we become a dictatorship. I think that's a little bit of an overstatement, but if it goes through, we will become an illiberal democracy. And I'm happy to say that a very, very large percentage of the population is simply unwilling to countenance that.
Very interesting. Now, what we're talking about is that if judiciary is brought under control of the Knesset, then you say there's no division of power within the Israeli state.
Under the government, the executive, and the Knesset is already under the executive. So you're left with one real branch of government, the executive, and they control everything.
But the people that propose, I agree with you. This is a problem in Israel, as far as I'm concerned, a big problem, because if you do not have independent Supreme Court, who knows what is going to happen? Today, these people are in power. Maybe they'll rewrite the laws of election. I do not know how it's going to be. And then there's going to be many other problems. But the arguments against the current position of Israeli Supreme Court, in my eyes, are very valid. That is, it interjects itself in areas where no other Supreme Court of any other country that I know of interjects itself. And the way it does with this inspector general and different inspectors from ministries and propagation of itself. Basically, there's some ability for people, to voice their opinion about who is going to be in that Supreme Court. But basically, it's Supreme Court decides who is going to continue whatever it's doing. So you do not have really a Supreme Court like in the United States or in other countries. I do not know of any other country where Supreme Court handles 12,000 cases a year. This is just not a Supreme Court. This is just some kind of a clerical doing things without thinking about it. No?
No, not in the slightest, Alex.
Okay.
First of all, I would much rather live in a country with too much judicial intervention, which I don't think there is, but I would rather that be the case than there be too little judicial intervention, especially since, again, we only have one check on the government. We only have two real branches of government. Now, all this talk of the fact that it's self-perpetuating.
Basically, Chuck, you are taking the side of Socrates in ancient Rome, in ancient Athens.
I don't remember the discussion.
What is it?
I don't remember the discussion. Remind me. It was before my time a bit.
Well, the discussion was this, that Socrates was a great fan of laws. I mean, that is one of the reasons that he did not leave, because he did not want to violate Athenian laws. But he hated democracy. He preferred the rule of those who know. And this is what you have in Supreme Court of Israel, rule of those who know.
You have, I think, again, an extraordinary Supreme Court, which has done remarkable work. We didn't hear any complaints, for example, what was it, a year plus ago, when they ruled 11-0 in favor of Netanyahu, that a prime minister under 3 criminal indictments could remain prime minister. Then they were okay. When they sometimes rule against the government, then they're not okay. Look, democracy, first of all, isn't just about majority rule. That's certainly one of the pillars. But it's also about protecting the rights of minorities. It's also about minority rights. It's about rule of law, separation of powers. If they wanted to change some thing here or there that needed improving, there's what to do. Nobody says it's perfect. This idea that it's self-perpetuating and it's the Hebrew expression is one friend brings his other friend on board. It's a closed clique of the judicial elite. Maybe that was true 20, 30 years ago. It's not true anymore. It's
still true. Out of 9 people, in the selection committee, 3 are from existing Supreme Court, and the other.
It's a minority.
Yeah.
And there are 3 politicians, and there are 3 public representatives, 2 or maybe all 3 from the Bar Association. It's like
this. It's like this: Supreme Court justice, 2 other justices, 2 right. From their friends in the legal bar association. And the other, one is from one party and one from another party. I think the argument of these Rothman people, and I disagree with Rothman on so many things, but on this particular thing, I do see his point. He says, look at this. If the left is in power, we have only one voice against it in this selection committee. If we're in power, we have 3 voices. It's still not enough, because out of 9, we have only 3 maximum. And
at most, if the left is in power, they also have 3. There are only 3 politicians.
No.
The justices are the justices, and the Bar Association is the Bar Association. And you can't have the politicians choosing their own representatives.
But then you forget another thing, that prime minister is going to be leftist, and one of the ministers from the government is going to be leftist, and they're on the selection committee. and
if it's
one person from the Knesset, from the ruling party.
It's the same thing. Today, you've got a right-wing prime minister at the head of a right-wing.
Just 1 second. This is one against the Supreme Court, and you have one minister.
There are 3 members of Knesset. There are always 3 members of Knesset, and there are 3 justices and 3 people from the Bar Association.
There's 2 members of Knesset.
Yeah, and the Minister of Justice.
And Minister of Justice. So it's a minister and Minister of Justice. So we have from the ruling party, you have one from Knesset, one from ministry, and one Minister of Justice. It's 3 from the ruling party.
Right. So whoever the ruling party is, they'll have the 3 political appointees.
So even if they have 3, there's 6 opponents. But in order to pass a law, you need 7. So they never win.
No, Alex, you're assuming that the other 6 are by definition against them.
Of course, Supreme Court justice against them, 2 of his associates against them, one from opponent from the Knesset is against them, and the other 2 from Bar Association, they're against them. They get the Supreme Court always has 6 at the minimum, and in order to pass the law.
Sorry, I disagree with you. With you. You're saying that it's by definition. I don't think that's the case. Okay. And I would much rather have Supreme Court justices. They used to, by the way, have a bigger majority. I think it was 5 up to a few years ago, and that was changed. I'd much rather go back to that between you and me. I want to keep political influences out of the Supreme Court.
I do too.
Well, one of the great things about the Israeli Supreme Court until now, unlike the American system, is that it was unpoliticized. And what these guys are doing is trying to politicize it.
This is not my view of history of Israeli Supreme Court. Right from the beginning, it was very political. I mean, it became in 1995 with Aharon Barak, major changes entered the Supreme Court. By the way, he made this vital decision 4 days after Rabin was shot. And I looked at it, and it's like October Revolution in Russia, because it was October Revolution on November 7th, and Aharon Barak in 1995 makes his revolution on November 8th. So November 7th, November 8th. I mean, this is just like a joke. And he declares 2 Shamir's laws to be part of Constitution, and therefore only he can touch them.
It was broad acceptance for a very long time that the so-called basic laws would be part of Israel's future constitution.
Of course, that's part of, yeah.
And I believe, I don't want to get into the timing of what he did. If maybe he should have done it 2 weeks later because Rabin had just been assassinated. That's really not a major issue.
But there is the reason he could do it, so nobody sees it. Nobody knows.
No. Everybody knew exactly what was happening. It was something that was in the making for a long time. And to my way of thinking, the only problem with it is that it didn't go far enough.
Okay, did not go. So you are a follower then of Socrates, because Socrates wanted exactly that. He wanted the judges, the Supreme Court, I mean, basically, ultimately tyrants. I mean, that's how Plato presents in Republic. But he wanted tyrants to rule because democracy is not good. Now, I agree with you. When I look at, let's say that they remove now, like, for example, this law, Levine's or whatever it is, Rothman's desire to overrule, to pass a law that allows them to overrule Supreme Court passes. I think it's a horrible thing, just absolutely horrible thing. Why? Because there's no brakes on the Knesset coalition. Knesset coalition appoints the prime minister, appoints the government, and can do whatever it wants. And what it wants to do, I disagree with what they want to do. But I have to say that what Supreme Court and the people that demonstrate for Supreme Court are doing, in my book, is not better at all. In fact, my feeling is that the time for Israel to actually have separate, at least confirmation, popular confirmation for Supreme Court judges, so they would become independent, but at least subject to elections and not to self-perpetuation.
God forbid if we have elections for judges. That's all we
You
need.
think God forbid? In Japan, Supreme Court judges do.
We're not Japan. We're not Japan, and we're not the United States, and every country has its own national culture. And one of the proposals that some people have suggested is to hold Knesset hearings for, like you have the hearings in the United States for Supreme Court appointments. I'm not sure how wonderful a system it is in the United States, but I have no doubt that in Israel it would be a total failure. The Knesset isn't a very serious legislative body. The hearings that it holds are generally not very serious holdings. One thing that was great about this system, and we may disagree about this, is that it was not a political system. And I don't have a major problem. I don't have a problem with the judges having a significant say in the appointment process. Who better than they to know who should be on that kind of a committee?
Somebody outside of, because although you say that they're not political,
6 out of the 9 are not
political. They're
6
very
out of the
political.
9.
Take a look at what they did just now. Now, you know my position. I mean, that with regard of who is a Jew, but what they did just now with regard to this Utah thing, that basically they introduced the civil marriage in Israel, made it not introduced, but made it less expensive. Just now. So don't tell me they're not political. They know exactly what they're doing.
That's political? Why is that political when they allowed people?
Because they did it at this particular, they did it particular time. Right now,
they didn't do it at a particular time, Alex. Things life goes on and things happen. The suit reached the court. They had to give a decision now. What are they going to say? We're not making any decisions until this crisis is over?
The suit reached the court. They accept whatever suit they like whenever they like. But that is not the point. We disagree on this. We agree that, it seems to me, we agree only on one thing, that there should be independent, sufficiently independent system of law, Supreme Court, etc., 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 and there should be government that does have some impact on it, but not overriding impact. That is, that there should be separation of powers, because without separation of powers, there is no freedom, there's no democracy. And then what you wrote there, to me, is very, very, very important. That is, if the army does not feel that they defend free Israel, the ability of that army to fight is greatly reduced.
Look, people are at the moment are scared stiff that if, for example, there was a need to give the Air Force an order to attack the Iranian nuclear program tomorrow, that the pilots wouldn't be there to do it. And the cyber units and the
how many pilots in Israel?
That's a secret number, but what isn't secret is that 60% of active pilots are reservists, and they're the ones who come and fly voluntarily a day a week, 1 day every week. That's quite a commitment for someone who's no longer in active service. And a lot of them have said very clearly, we will not serve a non-democratic regime.
37 of them said it, right?
No, that was one unit. That was one squadron.
Meaning it's spread throughout
it's hundreds have already made clear that they will not. Okay. The same is happening in the cyber units. It's happening in the intelligence units. It's happening in the commando units. The IDF is on the verge of coming apart. This is something that just a few weeks ago would have been totally unimaginable.
This is what Hezbollah is saying, and this is what Iran is saying, like you said in your article.
They love it. They love it. All they have to do is sit back. They don't have to spend a buck and let us destroy ourselves, because that's what's happening. Again, look, this entire thing here, I mean, let's be honest here. This is not about judicial reform. This is about Benjamin Netanyahu willing to do anything to go to all lengths to avoid jail time. Now, on a personal level, I sympathize with him. I wouldn't want to go to jail either.
Wouldn't you do it?
No, I would not take down the entire state of Israel with me. By the way, one of his predecessors, not that long ago, Ehud Olmert, resigned, stood trial, and went to prison. And Netanyahu has been fighting this. He took us through 5 elections in under 3 years, and that's not enough.
But
Now
that was, I'm
I'm
sorry, there was 3 lawsuits against him, and I looked at them, and at least 2, to me, look like absolutely nothing, just absolutely made up nothingness against Netanyahu for political reasons. And that's when we're talking about Supreme Court, or Attorney General getting involved in politics.
There are 3 charges. The lightest one is that he received $700,000 in presents.
Over what period of time? The guy is giving him.
It doesn't matter. You are not allowed. I was a civil servant for 20-something years of my life. I wasn't a prime minister. I was in a senior position, though. I got a present. The most expensive present I ever accepted was $10, because you're not allowed to, because there's a law that you're not allowed to keep out corruption, because the people who gave him hundreds of thousands of dollars in presents had an expectation, or might have had an expectation, that there would be favors in exchange. That's the lightest of the charges. The second charge was that he reached a deal for favorable newspaper coverage with Yediot Achronot, the biggest distribution paper in the country, in exchange for doing away with a significant part of their competition. Okay, so you do away with my competitors, and I'll give you favored coverage. That's called corruption. That's called bribery. And the third charge, which was the worst of them all, was that he agreed to regulatory changes worth hundreds of millions of dollars, not hundreds of thousands like charge 1, but hundreds of millions of dollars in exchange for favorable coverage from one of the internet news services in Israel. Voila. Okay. All 3 charges are serious charges. The Attorney General actually let him off very cheaply because there were other charges that could have been brought. He postponed this for years. He let his wife, who was convicted of improper behavior, he let her off with a tap on the wrist. He hasn't been persecuted by the legal system. He's been given extraordinarily good, lenient behavior by the legal system.
Okay, so he was not persecuted and he was given, as you say, lenient. I look at it differently. I do not know Netanyahu as well as you do. I've met him only once. I had a conversation only once, and I told him at that time that I would not support him for election to his face. But I have to say, right now, the problem for me is a horrible situation where there can actually be a civil war, a bloody civil war, like Herzog, president of Israel, is saying. So what do you think about that? Is it possible? I mean, you're in it.
Absolutely, it's possible. Everybody is talking about it. And there is some violence on the streets already. Fortunately, it hasn't been too bad yet, but we seem to be heading in that direction. Again, what is motivating this is mostly Netanyahu's personal interest. And then it's the fact that the Justice Minister, Levin, has some sort of personal animus for the very system that he's in charge of today. In his case, he really believes what he's doing. He's been speaking of this for 20 years, and now he has the opportunity. If they were bona fide about wanting to make some changes, then what they should have done is come to the country, said, we have 1 or 2 or 3 changes we want to make, and let's hold a normal Knesset debate about this. We're not trying to undermine the fundamental separation of powers. We're not trying to change Israel's democratic character. You could change the composition of the Judicial Appointment Committee. There's nothing holy about it. The only thing that is holy to me is that politicians do not control it. I'm sure there are different ways that it could be done. That's not what this is about. This is about a steamroller attempt to ram through an entire change in the system of government. And it's not by chance that a huge part of Israeli society, the best educated,
really huge. It seems like I don't remember the number of people taking part in protests ever being that large, even close.
Well, there was one exception that was even bigger, which was during the first Lebanon War in 1982. But other than that, you're right. This is the numbers are the largest. And then it was once or twice. Now it's been ongoing for a couple of months. So maybe to that extent, you're also right. Last night, the Saturday night protest, there was a few 100,000 people around the country. And if you want to compare that to the United States, then multiply the figure by 40. The United States has never had a demonstration that large. But it's not just the numbers, it's who is leading this, whether it's the pilots and the cyber guys and the intel from the IDF, but also the heads of business, the economic world, the heads of leading academics in Israel, the justices, former justices. Pretty much anyone, political scientists, anybody who has any understanding has come out totally against this.
So in your mind, what would be the path to peaceful resolution of this horrible conflict? That what is the path as far as you are concerned?
Look, the President Herzog put forward a compromise proposal, which I think the liberal camp or those who oppose the reforms really don't like, swallowed hard, and uniformly came out and said, okay, we'll accept it. And it was rejected by the government and the coalition within, I believe the figure was 17.
What were the main points of this plan?
He came up with various things which satisfied, nobody was completely satisfied on either side. He was not going to give the government a politicization of the judicial appointment process. He override of Knesset, of Supreme Court decisions would have to be by a much larger majority. Look, by the way, nobody's against complete override. What people are against is the idea of 61. So with a 1-seat majority, you could override a Supreme Court decision. If you ask me, 90, other people say 75, 80 seats. If that many people in the Knesset believe that a Supreme Court decision should be overturned, then maybe it's the Israeli equivalent of a change in the Constitution in the United States.
Yeah, because there was never majority of 70 or 80 in Israel.
Well, who wants 70? Maybe there were 80, no, but the idea is to make it very hard. It's like a constitutional change. In the United States, to do that, you need both houses of Congress. You need 2/3 of the states. It's virtually impossible. So there's been what? I think it's less than 20 in 250 years, right? But that could have been a reasonable.
But another problem that Israel does not really have a clear-cut constitution. There's a bunch of laws that supposedly are going to be written into constitution whenever it's going to appear. But right now there's not. And what we have here, we have a big portion of Israeli society, Arabs on one side, strictly Orthodox on the other side, that really do not want constitution.
Right. And at least the Orthodox have benefited from the fact that the Supreme Court has not intervened directly. I mean, all this talk about the court being too interventionist is, as far as I'm concerned, absurd. How is it that the Orthodox do not serve in the IDF after 75 years? How is it that we do not have an alternative to the rabbinate for people who either don't want to go there or who can't get married through the rabbinate? How come the reform and conservative movements are not recognized in the state of Israel? How come there is rabbinate-imposed kosher laws for restaurants that want to be kosher? I mean, this is absurd. Okay, I made Aliyah as a kid because I wanted to live in a Jewish country. I don't want to live in a non-democratic country or a country
How
from
old
which
were you?
I was 13. My family moved, but I was dying to make Aliyah at that age. I want a Jewish character. I love the fact that the national holidays are the Jewish holidays. But for me, it's a cultural thing. I don't want anybody to impose on me what I can do. This is outrageous. The court hasn't forced itself on those major issues. In the, what is it? It's 28 years since the so-called judicial revolution went through under Ron Barak. They've struck down 22 cases. That's it. Less than one a year. And half of them were administrative things. There are only a few that were controversial. This isn't about legal reform. This is about Netanyahu staying out of
How can you say that this is like today? There, I read open the news and I read that the Supreme Court, or it was Attorney General, tells Ben Gvir not to interfere, a national security minister, not to interfere with the way police behaves.
Because, of course, it was the Attorney General who happens in Israel has a dual role. She is also the, it's called the legal advisor to the cabinet. She is the one who, by law, interprets the law for the government. And what she said, and she happened, I mean, she's right. Under the law, the Minister of Police, or now the name is Minister of National Security, is not allowed to give operational orders to the policemen. What the minister can do is set overall policy for the police, but he's not an operational figure. He can't come in and say, you know, post this policeman there, post that guy there, hit that guy over the head.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here you're talking a situation where this minister is a guy who was convicted of 8 crimes, including racism and incitement for terrorism, terrorism and incitement to racism.
He's a minister of the government.
Yes, he was.
The Attorney General is supposed to serve the government. And in fact, what she's doing, she's making government serve her understanding of law.
Well, if the government doesn't like it, they can take her to court, which they may do in this case, or have done in lots of other cases. And then the Supreme Court decides. It is her job under law to interpret the law. She happens to be I think all of the attorney generals have really been non-political appointees in terms of their character. Yes, they're appointed by the Minister of Justice, but she was someone who was never associated with any particular political.
And they're appointed on a particular term, like 7 years or?
Well, yeah, I forget exactly what it is, 5, 7, yeah, something like that. She's doing her job under incredible conditions here because she's being attacked 24/7. She, by the way, is personally threatened. The Shin Bet has imposed the highest level of protection around her and her family. The idea you mentioned before about the legal advisors to the ministers. Yeah, one of the great things is that the legal advisors in the ministries are supposed to advise to the minister whether the policy that they want to make, want to adopt, is legal or not. Now, they can go ahead if they want. It's not a binding recommendation, but they have to understand that it will then be subject to judicial review.
But given their connection to Supreme Court, whatever recommendation they make, Supreme Court will back up. And right now, there's what I see there. I see a possibility, really possibility of the way this civil war may actually explode is if Supreme Court does what the government does not want to do, and government says no. And then the question is like Aaron Barak a long time ago said, you know, who the tanks are going to be going with. So the question is where the military is going to go, and then there's bloody civil war. Do we need it?
Well, first of all, do we need it? The answer, of course, no. And the way to avoid it is for the government to stop this absurd and obscene legislative process and focus on 2 or 3 things that they think really should be done and conduct a legitimate political process and discussion about it. Look, I think there is broad agreement among former chiefs of staff, former heads of the Shin Bet, former chiefs of police, and in this case, even the current chief of police, who've all made it clear that they will obey the court, not the minister. If it comes to a clash between the executive and the judiciary, they will obey the judiciary because that's what the law says. And now you're right, that's going to be a horrible situation, and that could be what leads to civil war. But if that's the case, there's no alternative, because otherwise the state of Israel sees...
There's no alternative?
No, there is no alternative to them obeying the judiciary, because the judiciary are the ones who interpret the law, not the government. The government has the right to adopt laws. The judiciary reviews them. That's the way it works in all democracies. And the minute that ceases, it's the way it works in the United States. It works everywhere.
It doesn't. The United States Supreme Court does not interfere in the same way in governmental decisions.
Of course it does. It makes decisions that determine what's legal for the executive branch to do. And they can even strike down congressional legislation.
Only when there's a problem with this decision affecting the laws, and that law goes through federal courts and goes then to Supreme Court. Very rarely, only in 2 or 3 occasions, Supreme Court did something directly on its own.
So you're right. In Israel, you've got two processes, 2 ways of getting to the Supreme Court. One is going through the lower courts, and you appeal decisions. Israel also has, the Supreme Court has 2 names. It's also called the High Court for Justice, where you can appeal directly to it. And that's how the very sensitive things like this.
How can they handle 12,000 cases a year?
I don't know where the number is from, and most of it is clearly, whatever the number is clearly not of major importance. They deal with X number of big issues a year, a fair number of them, yes.
I think American Supreme Court handles, 100 or 120 cases a year.
It's a different system, Alex.
Okay. In any case, I hope that we're going to talk again about it, because the story is not over.
No, it's just beginning.
This is just unfortunately beginning. And I have to say, somebody needs to do something. You say that it's Netanyahu that needs to sacrifice himself, right?
He doesn't have to sacrifice himself.
I mean, to leave, if he's going to leave this thing, he's going to go to jail.
Well, that's what happens when you violate the law.
Well, that's what happens when you have people that want to put you in jail. Now, and we can argue about this, but what I'm saying is that Netanyahu, if he leaves, he's going to jail.
He will,
and so you want him to. You want him to become a martyr.
He will continue to stand trial, and if he is convicted by this lower court, he can appeal, and he can appeal to the Supreme Court. If, when that process is over, he is convicted, then he will have to go to jail. That's the way it works in a democracy with rule of law.
Right. That's the way it works in democracy. We're all lawyers in cahoots, and he knows it. And the thing is, so you want him to be a person that will make the step. Now, on the left side, is there somebody that can make similar step toward, because we do not want war. We do not want civil war. There's war coming right now from all sides in Israel. Iran, Russia, Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinians, Arabs inside of Israel. You want more war? You want war between Jews?
Absolutely not. I didn't initiate this.
So I understand that you are not to be blamed.
No, not me personally. I mean, the center left, the left, the liberal camp, whatever you want to call it. Actually, there's a fair number of people on the right there.
Let's say that Netanyahu says, okay, I'm leaving, I'm going to go to jail, I'm not going to be prime minister. Then what happens?
Then if they stop the illegal process, then there won't be a problem.
What illegal process they stop?
I said not illegal, the legal process. These so-called reforms. If they
So you
narrow
want
that,
not simply Netanyahu to leave, you want
I didn't say he has to
message.
leave. I didn't say he has to leave. I
But
said he has to stand trial like any other citizen.
I understand that is leaving. That is leaving as a prime minister. You cannot do it to prime minister and keep, some semblance of the government.
Why not? He's been prime minister for the last few years and he's been under trial that whole time. There's no
Well,
problem. I mean, yes, there is
only
a
in
problem.
Israel. This is horrible. It should be like in at least some countries where prime minister cannot be a judge until he stops being a prime minister.
Why? Why? I think the Israeli system is much better than the American from
No,
that
it's
point of
not.
view.
It's not.
The fact
It's
that
not at all.
if the attorney general has indicted you, in
Attorney
this case,
General can indict anybody. It's up
this was
to
an attorney general who he appointed. He was a right winger. He comes from a stern home. He's religious. It took him, I think, yes, Mendelblit. It took him 5 or 6 years to finally submit the indictments.
I did not like him. I did not like him as a person. You say that he is a sterling individual. I don't
I
believe
didn't say sterling. I said he comes from a stern family
stern
from
family.
from the
And,
not the
and
from the
just because he's Orthodox, it does not mean anything to
he
me.
comes from a right-wing family. He was Bibi's appointment. He was the chief attorney general in the IDF. The man is a hardliner. He says it to this day. He is. He hasn't changed his political views. He said that the prime minister, I mean, of course, innocent until proven guilty, but there was sufficient grounds for bringing him to trial. One of the advantages of parliamentary systems, unlike presidential systems, and parliamentary systems have other disadvantages, but one of the advantages is that, yes, if a prime minister is thought to be guilty of crimes, he can be tried while prime minister. Olmert had the decency to step down. This guy is bringing the country down with him.
Well, hopefully Netanyahu hears our conversation and he decides to do what you tell him to do. And then hopefully Israel will avoid the civil war, because the way I see it, if he does not do it, people like you are going to try to bury him regardless the cost for the country.
It's not about him.
Oh, so it's not about him. So why?
No, I don't care.
What is it about? What is it about?
It is about upholding the rule of law. If he is acquitted, then all power to him. And
outside of him, what is it about? Outside of Netanyahu, what is it about?
It is about maintaining Israeli democracy and rule of law. That's what it's about. No one is above the law. And at this point, since they went so overboard, as far as the opposition, the masses of people who are demonstrating in the streets, it isn't even just about the judicial reforms anymore. It's now about a lot of more basic issues. One of the big demands that's being raised is to finally have a constitution. And other people are saying, enough of this business with the Orthodox.
This is a good thing that you said, finally have a constitution. Tell me, how a country so divided can produce constitution?
I think it's going to be very hard. And
it's impossible.
Maybe.
I mean, America was able, the colonies were able to produce constitution divided, but they had an enemy and they had something in common much more than what Israelis of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem have in common.
Well, there's a day of reckoning that Israel's going to have to face over 2 or 3 broad areas. One is the future of the West Bank and the whole Palestinian issue. And the other is synagogue-state relations.
And what is the third one?
Well, I said 2. Maybe there are some others.
2 is enough.
Those are the 2 primary ones.
When you say West Bank, you mean Judea and Samaria?
No, I mean the West Bank. And
you mean to tell me that Gaza did not teach you anything?
Yeah, it taught me that it was a good beginning.
It was good beginning. So to create a platform for shooting at Israel at will?
No, No, nobody's
So
talking
now
about
you
it.
want to create Plattsdarm even closer to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem.
No one is talking about just getting up and walking out of the West Bank today. What people like myself do talk about is ending settlement, encouraging those who are new settlement, encouraging settlers who are there to come back home in exchange for financial incentives, and trying to begin talks with Palestinians, if and when there is a Palestinian partner,
But there were talks of
a
people like
two-state
you
solution.
forever, and they caused nothing but grief for Jews in Israel. Nothing but grief.
Well, the alternative is that we become a non-democratic state or a non-Jewish state.
I prefer it
I
to be
don't-
Jewish and non-democratic anytime.
Well, you're welcome to, you're entitled to your views. I refuse to live in a country that isn't a democracy. I do
You
not
have
want to live
American
in.
citizenship.
You're right. I could leave anytime I wanted to.
Yeah.
That's not why I made Aliyah. And that's not why I live here today. I want a country which is both predominantly Jewish and vibrantly democratic. At the moment, the policies of Israel's governments, not the moment, for the last few decades, are creating a situation which endangers both of those fundamental pillars of our future. So a reckoning is building about that, because the current policy leads to an irreversible one-state reality, which is the end of a Jewish and democratic Israel. And the other issue is synagogue and state. Now, a lot of people say, well, look, the IDF doesn't really need the ultra-Orthodox, and most of them aren't suited for service anyway. Well, I don't know what that means. I don't know that. I mean, I served for 5 years. I don't know that I was born to do military service, and that other secular people like myself have some genetic trait which means that we can serve while the others sit in their
I disagree with those. I disagree with those people that have this opinion. I believe that if Orthodox Jews are not willing to serve in Israel, they should not have many of the rights that they have currently now.
Well, I don't think they should have that choice. I think the solution is for the IDF to be given the right to draft everyone, and then the IDF will actually draft those people who they think will be of benefit to it. Much like the U.S. during the years when there was a draft, there was something called the Selective Service Administration, and they decided who they wanted. And then everyone is subject to draft, and most Haredim, most ultra-Orthodox won't actually serve, but at least there'll be a fair process.
Why won't they serve?
Because most of them won't want to, and they'll play all sorts of games, and they'll fight it. But at least some will serve.
I think that if that's how they feel, then them being present in the army is a bad idea. But the government should not be financing their Torah education and yeshivot, period.
Well, at least on that.
A person like you should not be paying for somebody else who does not want to serve while you are defending and working and paying taxes. This is wrong.
I agree.
And those are horrible problems in Israeli society.
Okay, so as I was saying, I mean, both issues are coming to a head. By 2060, which is not very far off, a third of the Jewish population will be ultra-Orthodox, Haredi. That is economic ruin for the state of Israel, because we cannot bear that burden. And since these people believe that the Rabbeinu Shalom, not the Knesset, is the focus of, is the source of authority, I mean, that's who they turn to as the source of authority, not to the Knesset and not to the Supreme Court. It's a huge danger to Israeli democracy. This
is a horrible thing. I want to invite somebody, from strictly Orthodox Jews, from Israel, to talk about what do they mean. I mean, I know that many of them, like Satmar and especially Neturei Karta, they don't even want to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. But there's also a lot of Orthodox. I want to know, what is the idea of a Jewish state from the point in their minds? What kind of a state is it? What is it?
In the end, it's halakha.
But halakha does not say anything about the state. What it says cannot make a state. I mean, we already had two temples, two states, and supposedly in some way, according to halacha, although one was God knows what, and another was even worse, was Ezra under rule of Persians, and where did it lead? I mean, it leads to continuous division among Jews, to civil wars among Jews continuously. During the first temple, during the second temple, we need to stop it. I mean, there's too much blood that has been spilled.
The third temple is shaking at the moment.
But people like you also undermine the third temple because you want to give Jerusalem to Arabs. Because more than so-called West Bank, Arabs want Jerusalem.
There won't, I mean, I don't know who these Arabs are. Yes, the Muslims will have to have sovereignty over Muslim holy places.
And Temple Mount is not their place.
No, I mean, part of it is ours.
No, it's not. None of it is.
Yeah, well,
they're occupiers. They conquered it. Just because it was 1,000 years ago, it does not mean anything. In any case, Chuck, unfortunately, neither you or I have solutions. But
well, I think I have solutions.
So, tell me, what is the solution?
I mentioned them to you. One is to stop this headlong stampede towards the judicial reforms and to focus on a couple of areas where there may be legitimate need for improvement, and that can be worked out. Everyone's willing to talk about that. The second thing is to work very cautiously when we actually have a partner on the Palestinian side, which I do not believe that we have at the moment, towards a two-state solution.
I apologize, but Palestinian autonomy was something that was created by people like you and put in place.
No, autonomy was first proposed by Menachem Begin, and I'm not talking about autonomy. I'm talking about a separation between Israelis and Palestinians, a complete separation with
meaning like they want to have their own army and to have everything uncontrolled by Jews?
No. Along the lines of the Clinton proposal from 2000, it'll have to be updated in some areas.
That was a horrible, horrible proposal.
It was an outstanding proposal, which might not have actually succeeded. That's always the case. But people who look for absolute security actually guarantee that they will never achieve that security. There's always a danger in life. At the moment, the danger is that we will cease to be a Jewish and democratic state. I'm talking about a cautious situation to the extent that there are watertight security arrangements, and there aren't really, but to the extent that there are, that will be one of the conditions. Because otherwise, we know what our future looks like. This way, there's hope for a better future. May not work, but at least there's hope.
Very interesting. Well, okay. We'll see what is going to happen. It seems like neither side in Israel wants to be reasonable. That is a horrible situation. But on the other hand, maybe if the war will begin by Hamas and Hezbollah, maybe then you'll decide that you do need to defend yourself and your family and your friends and stop bickering.
Yeah,
unless you want to join Hezbollah.
I never had any doubt about that. I spent over 20 years in the defense establishment, and in the years since I left, 17 years ago, I've been an academic expert on Israeli security affairs. As far as I'm concerned, I'm still part of the defense establishment. Nothing is more important to me, short of maintaining a democracy, than Israel's security, or maybe the security even comes first, because without the security, there won't be a democracy. So you don't have to tell me about that, Alex.
I have to, because I see that there's really wide gaps between you and me and between people on one side of political spectrum in Israel and another. So hopefully,
life is complicated.
Let's see what is going to happen. In my mind, we'll survive as Jewish people. As Israel, I do not know if we'll survive. We had bad record of it. In any case, Chuck, nice talking to you, and hopefully we'll talk again. Maybe something is going to happen. As they say in China, sei gesund, be
Sei
well, and the very best.
Thank you. Bye-bye.